The first glyph lit before Corin's boot touched the floor of the hold. He had been lowering himself through a breach in the ship's dorsal plating, a jagged wound punched through the hull by 500,000 years of geological compression, and his harness line still held his weight when the carved groove in the deck below him ignited in a thin, pale gold thread of light that ran from the breach toward the interior darkness like a vein, finding its pulse. He stopped, hung there 3 meters above the deck, his headlamp cutting a white cone through dust that had not moved in epochs. The light in the glyph pulsed once, twice, then held steady, and the dust motes nearest the groove drifted toward it as though drawn by a current that had no source he could name. Yale to base camp. His voice was steady. 23 years of field archaeology across 11 worlds had trained the startle reflex out of him, or at least buried it deep enough that it registered as a tightening in his chest rather than a sound. I have active luminescence on the interior deck. Single glyph line, approximately 4 centimeters wide, running 4 from the breach point. Gold emission. No heat signature on my wrist unit. Static. The canyon walls were 300 meters of compressed basalt and sedimentary iron, and the relay booster he had anchored at the rim was marginal at best. He had known that when he descended. He had descended anyway, because the ship in the canyon floor of Verath Gorge had been dead for 500,000 years, and dead things did not require backup. The glyph disagreed. Corin released another 2 meters of line and dropped to the deck. His boot struck metal, not stone, not composite, but a dense black alloy that rang under his weight with a sound so pure it seemed orchestrated. The vibration traveled through his soles and up his shins, and as it faded, a second glyph line ignited. Then a third. Then a fourth, branching from the first like tributaries joining a river, each one tracing a path deeper into the ship's interior, each one carrying that same pale gold luminescence that had no business existing in a vessel that every scan had classified as inert. He had classified it as inert himself. That was the part that sat poorly with his professional conscience as he unclipped from the harness and took his first step forward. The ship in Verath Gorge had been his find. 18 months earlier, running a routine geological survey for the Tessarine Compact's Frontier Mapping Division, the kind of contract work that senior archaeologists accepted when their grant funding dried up, and their publication record grew too specialized for the committees that decided who got to dig, and who got to measure rock density on worlds that nobody cared about. He had flagged an anomaly in the canyon's subsurface profile. A void, roughly cylindrical, 210 meters long and 42 wide, buried under 90 meters of sediment at the canyon's deepest point. The surrounding geology dated it to the mid-Pleistocene epoch by galactic reckoning. 500,000 years, give or take the margin of error that came with dating sedimentary compression on a world with no indigenous calendar. The Compact's Regional Archaeology Office had authorized a preliminary excavation. Not because they believed the void was significant. Cylindrical voids in canyon geology were usually lava tubes, collapsed aquifers, or the fossilized shells of organisms too large and too ancient to have left other traces, but because Corin's survey contract required a minimum number of investigated anomalies per quarter, and the void was convenient. A box to check, a line on a report. What they found was a ship. Not a wreck, not debris, not the scattered remnants of something that had crashed and broken apart across a landscape, leaving the fragmentary evidence that frontier archaeologists spent their careers reassembling into theories. A ship intact, sealed, its hull a single unbroken shell of the same dense black alloy that now rang beneath Corin's feet, buried nose down in the canyon floor at an angle that suggested controlled descent, not impact. The hull bore no markings that any database in the Compact's archaeological network could match. The alloy resisted every sampling tool the excavation team attempted. Drill bits shattered against it. Cutting lasers scattered into diffuse fans of harmless light. Molecular probes returned readings so contradictory that Dr. Ashen rasped, the team's materials scientist, had quietly suggested the alloy might not be a single substance at all but a dynamic lattice that reorganized its molecular structure in response to contact, like a skin that healed every wound before the wound could teach you what lived underneath. They had not gotten inside. 18 months of careful excavation had exposed the upper third of the hull, the dorsal section, roughly 80 meters of curved black surface emerging from the canyon wall like the spine of something enormous breaking through frozen earth. Every hatch, seam, and port the team identified was sealed. Not locked. Locked implied a mechanism that could be defeated, a keyhole that could be picked, a code that could be cracked. These were fused. The hull around each potential entry point had bonded to itself at the molecular level, as though the ship had decided, at some point in its long burial, to become a single solid object rather than a vessel with openings. Corin had spent those 18 months documenting the hull's exterior with the quiet, methodical obsession that was both his professional trademark and the reason his career had plateaued at a level that more ambitious archaeologists pass through on their way to department chairs, keynote invitations, and the kind of funding that came with a reputation rather than a contract number. He mapped every micron of exposed surface. He cataloged over 12,000 individual glyphs carved into the hull, shallow, precise, cut with the same submolecular accuracy that he had encountered on only one other class of artifact in his career. The pre-compact monoliths scattered across uninhabited worlds in the deep frontier, the ones that every xenoarchaeologist agreed were significant and no xenoarchaeologist could explain. The monoliths had been his dissertation subject. 12 years ago, he had spent 2 solitary years on a wind-scoured world called Dren's Reach, cataloging the glyph morphology of a 12-meter monolith standing in the center of an empty plain, and he had published a paper arguing, based on chisel depth patterns, stroke sequencing, and the microstructural tool marks that most linguists treated as noise, that the monolith glyphs and the glyphs found on 6 other frontier monoliths were all products of a single unified writing system. The paper had been well received in the narrow community that cared about such things. 3 citations in the first year, 1 invitation to present at a regional symposium, no follow-up funding. His advisor had said, kindly, that the work was solid but perhaps too granular for the current funding landscape, which was the academic way of saying that nobody with money believed chisel depth mattered. But the pattern had stayed in his memory, the particular ratio of chisel depth to line width 1:4:7, consistent across all 7 monolith sites, precise to a tolerance of less than 2%. The stroke order, visible under magnification, that showed right-to-left primary cuts with secondary fills running perpendicular, a technique that required a specific grip and a specific tool angle that was biomechanically optimized for. And this was the detail he had never published, because the claim would have been dismissed without corroboration. A human hand. Not a tessarine hand. Not a Drevany hand. Not any of the 14 species in the compact whose physiology had been cross-referenced against the tool marks. A human hand with human finger proportions, human wrist flexibility, human grip strength. When he saw the same ratios, the same stroke patterns, the same spacing on the hull of the ship in Verath Gorge, he had said nothing. Not to Dr. Tenek, the dig team lead, not to Rast, not to the compact's regional office. He had simply added a private annotation to his survey notes, morphological consistency with Dr. 7 monolith corpus, high, and continued his documentation 1 glyph at a time the way he had always worked, quietly, carefully, letting the evidence accumulate until the pattern was undeniable. Because if the ship's glyphs matched the monolith glyphs, then the ship was built by the same hands that had placed markers across the deep frontier 500,000 years ago. And if those hands were human, then the ship was not a random derelict buried by geological accident. It was placed here, deliberately, carefully, nose down in a canyon on a world that nobody had any reason to visit, sealed against entry and left to wait. for what he had not known, until 6 days ago when the ship decided to tell him. The breach had appeared on a Tuesday. Corin used the word anyway, though it had no meaning on a world with a 37-hour rotation, because there was something anchoring about marking time in the old way when everything else was becoming unmoored. He had been running his morning survey along the dorsal crest, the highest point of exposed hull, where the black alloy met the canyon's sedimentary walls, when his hand scanner registered an atmospheric discontinuity. A pocket of warm air, seeping from the hull's surface at a point where, the previous day, the surface had been continuous and sealed. He had knelt, pressed his palm flat against the alloy, a habit, not a protocol, the tactile verification of a man who trusted his hands as much as his instruments, and felt what his instruments confirmed: a seam, hairline thin, barely perceptible under his fingertips, running in a clean 2-meter line along the dorsal crest. By the time Dr. Tenek reached the site 40 minutes later, the seam had widened to a centimeter. The hull plating was separating. Not cracking, separating. The two sections drawing apart with the smooth, unhurried precision of a door that had been designed to open this way and was now, after 500,000 years, executing its design. By midday, the breach was complete. A wound 2 meters long and 1 meter wide, the edges clean, the metal folded back like the pages of a book open to a particular chapter. No heat residue, no stress fractures, no evidence of force. Warm air rising from the interior, carrying a scent that none of the dig team could identify, not unpleasant, not chemical, something organic and faintly sweet, like the memory of soil after rain in a place that had not seen rain in geological time. Rast had called it spontaneous fracture due to thermal cycling. Tenek had accepted the assessment for the official report. Corin had nodded and filed his own observations silently. The edges of the breach were not fractured. They were folded, with the same submolecular precision as the glyphs. The ship had not broken. It had opened. And in the 6 days since, while the team debated safety protocols, rigged harness lines, ran atmospheric analyses, and transmitted reports to the regional office requesting a hazard assessment team that would take 3 weeks to arrive, Corin had stood at that opening every morning and every evening, feeling the warm air on his face, watching the pale canyon daylight slide into the dark interior and illuminate nothing, and knowing, not suspecting, not hypothesizing. Knowing in the place below hypothesis where pattern recognition lived and where 23 years of field instinct had their roots, that the ship had opened for a reason, and that the reason was standing at the rim, waiting for the courage to descend. This morning, before the team's briefing, before the canyon daylight had fully reached the excavation floor, he had clipped into a harness, checked his wrist unit, said nothing to anyone, and dropped through the breach into the oldest air he had ever breathed. Now he followed the glyph lines deeper into the hold, and the ship followed him back. Every step he took, the deck responded. Glyph channels ignited ahead of him, not as though anticipating his path. He tested this by stopping twice, changing direction, doubling back, and each time the light recalibrated to his new position. But as though his presence was the input the system required, and wherever that input moved, the system tracked it. The pattern on the deck was not a road. It was a nervous system, and his footsteps were the stimulus. The interior was vast. His headlamp could not find the far wall. The ceiling arched overhead at a height of perhaps 20 meters, supported by ribbed structural members that curved like the bones of a chest cavity, and the glyph lines ran along the floor in branching patterns that grew denser as he moved forward. Behind him, the path he had walked was a web of warm gold light traced across the black deck, and the breach was a pale rectangle of canyon daylight framed by a luminous map of his own passage. The air around him, breathable, stable, a steady 19 degrees despite the canyon exterior sitting at 4 below zero, was being maintained, actively, for something that every instrument in the compact's inventory had declared inert, powerless, and dead. The ship was doing a thorough impression of a living system that had simply been holding its breath. At 40 meters from the breach, he found the first secondary chamber, a doorway on the starboard side, its edges marked by raised glyphs that had ignited when he approached and now cast amber light into a room the size of a small auditorium. Inside, arrayed on low platforms of the black alloy, were objects, dozens of them. Spheres, cubes, irregular polyhedra, each one made of different materials, stone, crystal, something that looked like compacted volcanic ash, something that might have been fossilized wood, and each one carved with glyphs. The same glyph system, the same hand, the same chisel depth ratio that he had measured on 7 monoliths and 12,000 hull markings. He did not enter. The archaeologist's reflex pulled at him, the hunger to catalog, to measure, to understand, but the main glyph channel on the deck ran past the doorway, not into it, and something in the pattern's behavior suggested that the secondary chambers were not the destination. They were inventory. The ship had been sealed with everything inside it, and everything inside it had been preserved for 500,000 years in an atmosphere so carefully maintained that the objects on the platforms showed no degradation, no corrosion, no dust. A library, packed for a journey whose duration the builders had measured in geological epochs. He kept walking. Each step ignited new channels. Each new channel deepened the web of gold behind him. At 60 meters, a second chamber. This one contained what looked like workstations' surfaces at standing height, embedded with channels that matched the deck patterns, surrounded by curved screens of translucent material that might have been crystal or might have been something the compact had no classification for. The screens were dark. The channels were not lit. The room had the quality of a place that was ready but not active, a system waiting for an operator, the way a console waits for hands. At 75 meters, the glyph channels on the deck began to pulse. Not the steady luminescence he had been following, but a rhythmic brightening and dimming, once per second, slow, measured, like a heartbeat heard from a long way off. The pulse pattern ran ahead of him, toward whatever the main channel was leading to, and the ship's ambient hum shifted, deepened, gained a harmonic overtone that Corin felt less in his ears and more in the flat bones of his sternum. The ship knew he was close. At 80 meters, a third chamber, and this one stopped him in the doorway. It was small, perhaps 5 meters square. The walls were lined with panels of the translucent material, and behind the panels, visible through the crystal the way objects are visible through clear ice, were shapes. A hand tool, long-handled, blade curved, designed for a grip he recognized. A garment folded into a precise rectangle, its fabric a deep indigo that had not faded in 500 millennia. A pair of boots, thick-soled, worn at the heel, sized for a human foot. And on the rear wall, mounted at eye height, a flat panel of the black alloy into which a single image had been carved in relief. A figure standing, arms at its sides, palms forward, face lifted. Human proportions, human posture, human in every ratio and joint and angle. The face was generic, not a portrait but a type, the way a symbol on a door indicates male or female without specifying which male, which female. Human, just human. Carved into the wall of a ship buried for 500,000 years on a world where no human had set foot, until the compact's survey drones passed through 16 centuries ago. The carving's palms forward posture was not a surrender. It was an offering. Corin had seen it on 2 of the frontier monoliths, the same stance, carved into stone 500,000 years old, facing outward as though greeting someone who had not yet arrived. He had catalogued it as a reception figure in his field notes and moved on. Now, standing 3 meters from the same gesture rendered in the wall of a ship that was waking around him, he understood what it was. A welcome, placed here by builders who had known that the person it was meant for would not arrive for a very long time, and had wanted them to know, when they finally did, that they were expected. He memorized the chamber's contents, the tool, the garment, the boots, the figure, and kept walking, because the glyph channel's pulse was growing stronger, and the ship's hum had gained a second harmonic, and the air in the hold carried a warmth now that had nothing to do with temperature control and everything to do with proximity to something that had been patient for longer than patience should be possible. At 90 meters, the glyph channels on the deck split into two tracks. The main channel continued forward, toward the platform he had not yet seen, but a secondary channel branched left, running along the port bulkhead in a line of amber that pulsed at a different rhythm than the others. Faster, more insistent, as though this particular path led somewhere that the ship wanted him to see, but that was not his final destination. He followed it for 12 meters and found a fourth chamber. This one was larger than the others, 15 meters deep, 10 wide, the ceiling lower, the space more utilitarian. Banks of what could only be described as drawers lined both walls, each one a rectangular panel of the black alloy set flush with the bulkhead, each one marked with a cluster of glyphs that his headlamp revealed in sharp white detail against the amber glow of the floor channels. He approached the nearest bank and placed his hand flat against one of the panels, the way he had placed his hand on the hull 6 days ago when the seam first appeared. The panel slid open, smoothly, silently, on mechanisms that had waited 500,000 years and showed no resistance. Inside, resting on a shelf of the translucent crystal material, was a flat rectangular object the size of a book. Black alloy frame, translucent crystal face, glyphs etched into the frame in lines so fine they were barely visible. And on the crystal face, visible through its surface, the way diagrams are visible through drafting paper, a pattern of lines and points that Corin recognized with a jolt of professional vertigo. A star chart. Not a modern one. The stellar positions were wrong, shifted by the proper motion of 500,000 years of galactic rotation. But the format was unmistakable to anyone who had spent a career navigating the deep frontier. Reference stars marked with glyph designations, transit lanes indicated by curved lines connecting waypoints, and at the center of the chart, circled by a ring of glyphs that his hands itched to measure and catalog, a single bright point that burned with a faint internal luminescence of its own. A destination or a home. The drawer beside the chart held a second object, a small cylinder of the translucent crystal, etched with a denser cluster of glyphs than anything he had seen on the hull. He did not touch it, but he knelt close enough to study the glyph pattern, and what he saw made him exhale slowly through his nose, the way he did when a measurement confirmed something that changed the scale of the project. The glyphs on the cylinder were arranged in paired sequences. Each pair consisted of a symbol he recognized from the hull, a word, or a concept, and a symbol he had never seen before. The format was unmistakable to anyone who had spent a career studying linguistic transmission. It was a key, a translation guide. Someone 500,000 years ago had built a Rosetta Stone and sealed it in a drawer in the hold of a ship buried under 90 meters of canyon sediment, because they had known that the person who found it would need help reading what they had left behind. The builders had not merely preserved their language. They had preserved the instructions for learning it. He memorized both objects' positions, stepped back and returned to the main glyph channel. There would be time. The ship had waited 500,000 years. It could wait for him to do this properly. At 95 meters, the air changed again. The temperature rose by 2 degrees, his wrist unit noted it, and the scent that had met him at the breach intensified. That organic, faintly sweet smell, like a garden remembered rather than encountered. It was coming from ahead, from the convergence point where all the glyph channels ran, and as he drew closer, the ship's hum deepened into a register that he felt not just in his sternum but in his teeth, in his fingertips, in the arches of his feet. Every bone in his body was resonating, and the resonance was not uncomfortable. It was like tuning. Like an instrument being brought into pitch, by an orchestra that had been holding the notes since before the audience arrived. The hum carried something else now. A subharmonic, felt more than heard, that settled into the bones of his forearms and the hinge of his jaw. It felt impossibly like language, not words, not grammar, but the prelinguistic shape of communication, the intent behind meaning. The ship was not simply activating. It was speaking. The glyphs on the deck were its written voice, the bone frequency was its spoken voice, and the harmonic chord building in the hull was something larger, a voice meant to carry beyond the canyon, beyond the world, perhaps beyond the system. A signal that the builders had designed to reach as far as the glyphs themselves, wherever there were ears tuned to the right frequency, wherever there were human bones. He paused and pressed his hand against the nearest structural rib. The vibration ran through his palm and into the small bones of his wrist, and in that contact he felt the full scale of the ship for the first time, not just the hold he was standing in, but the 200 meters of hull stretching below him into the sediment, the sealed decks and compartments and systems that 90 meters of compressed earth had hidden from every scanner the team possessed. The ship was enormous. The hold was its greeting room, the way a front hall is a greeting room, not the house itself, but the first space you enter when you come home. Beyond it lay rooms he had not seen, systems he had not activated, records he had not read. A lifetime of work. Several lifetimes if the scope was what the glyph density suggested. And it had all been left for someone exactly like him, not a hero, not a conqueror, a man who measured chisel depth and let the evidence accumulate, a keeper. At 100 meters from the breach, the channels converged. The branching tributaries gathered into a single wide groove, nearly a meter across, carved deeper than the others, its luminescence brighter and steadier, the gold shifting toward rich amber at its center. The channel ran straight ahead, and his headlamp found the terminus in stages. First the base of a raised platform, 3 meters wide, wrought from the same black alloy. Then its smooth surface, reflecting his light without distortion. Then the object resting in a shallow cradle shaped precisely to hold it. A sphere, 1/2 meter in diameter. The surface was not the black alloy of the ship. It was something translucent, a material that resembled smoky quartz but caught the gold glyph light from the deck and held it, refracting it internally so that the sphere glowed from within. Layer upon layer of amber and gold light folded through its depths like weather systems viewed from orbit, and the effect was not decorative. It was functional. The light cycled through the sphere's interior in patterns that repeated, shifted, and repeated again. A system running diagnostics after a very long sleep. Glyphs were carved into its surface, not the shallow, precise cuts of the hull. These were raised, extruded from the material itself, as though the sphere had grown its own inscription over time. They spiraled from the base to the apex in a pattern that Corin recognized instantly, because he had spent 18 months mapping the same pattern on the exterior hull, and 12 years before that, 2 solitary years mapping it on the monolith at Dren's Reach. The same language, the same hand, the same tradition that had placed markers across the deep frontier and then gone silent, leaving nothing behind but stone and patience, and a script that nobody alive could read. He stood at the edge of the platform. The glyph channel pulsed at his feet, amber and patient. The sphere glowed. The ship hummed, a sound so low it was more sensation than noise, felt in the sternum, in the jaw, in the small bones behind the ear. Not mechanical, not electrical. Something that sounded the way a heartbeat might if the heart were 200 meters long, and built from an alloy that reorganized itself to survive geological time. He should call base camp again. He should anchor a sensor array. He should retreat to professional distance, the way protocol required, and wait for the hazard team 3 weeks away, and let the committees decide what to touch and when and how. He should be cautious, methodical, restrained, all the qualities that had defined his career and limited it in equal measure. He thought about the reception figure in the small chamber, palms forward, face lifted, the oldest welcome still intact in the galaxy, carved by people who had measured the weight in hundreds of thousands of years and had decided it was worth the patience. He stepped onto the platform. The deck shifted under his weight. The texture beneath his boots softened, becoming slightly yielding, as though the metal had adjusted to accept him the way a floor adjusts to a recognized footstep, not with mechanical response, but with the subtle compliance of something that had been shaped for this specific load. The glyph channel behind him flared once, bright gold, then dimmed to a steady amber. The sphere turned. Not rotated on its cradle. Turned the way a face turns toward a voice it has been listening for. The raised glyphs on its surface shifted, realigning, the spiraling pattern adjusting itself so that one particular sequence of symbols faced Corin directly. The internal light brightened. The amber deepened to a rich gold that threw warm shadows across his chest and arms and hands. And in the reflected light, his hands looked like they belonged to a longer history than the one he carried. He heard it then, not with his ears, with his ribs, a frequency so low that it bypassed the auditory system entirely and resonated in the bone, and the signal it carried was not a word in any language he knew, but he understood it the way you understand a hand on your shoulder in the dark, not as meaning, as recognition. The sphere knew him. Not him specifically. Not Dr. Corin Yale, 41 years old, contract surveyor, a man whose career highlight was a moderately cited paper on monolith glyph morphology. It knew what he was. It knew the species, the lineage, the particular arrangement of carbon and calcium and inherited code that separated his kind from every other kind that had passed through the galaxy in the 500,000 years since this ship was sealed. And it was not surprised. It was not alarmed. It was doing what it had been built to do, the thing it had waited 500,000 years to do. It was answering. The glyphs on the sphere's surface moved faster. The spiral tightened, symbols rearranging into a configuration that Corin had never seen on any artifact, in any database, in any record. And yet, as he watched them settle, something shifted in his understanding like a lens rotating into focus. The recognition did not come from study or analysis, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere structural, the part of cognition that recognized faces before names and understood grammar before vocabulary. The symbols were not alien. They had never been alien. The reason no xenolinguistic database could match them, the reason 12,000 Hull glyphs had resisted every translation attempt for 18 months, was not that they were written in an unknown language. They were written in the oldest known one. Human. Not modern human. Not any script that survived in any archive or library or data system on any world that humanity currently occupied. But human in origin, human in structure, human in the deep grammatical architecture that linguistic analysis could detect even when the surface features had changed beyond all recognition. The glyph system carved into this ship, into the monolith scattered across the deep frontier, into the sphere that was now turning its brightest face toward him, was a human writing system that predated every civilization the Compact had ever catalogued. His species had been here before, not recently, not in any era that history remembered. 500,000 years ago, when the canyon was a plain and the sediment was sky, human hands had built this ship, carved these glyphs, sealed this hold, placed this sphere on this platform and walked away, knowing with the certainty of people who planned across geological time, that their descendants would forget everything, and then, slowly over hundreds of thousands of years, remember enough to come back. His hands were shaking. He was aware of it distantly. His headlamp threw a hard white circle on the sphere's surface, but the sphere's own gold light had grown strong enough to make it irrelevant. He reached for it, not because training suggested it, not because protocol permitted it. Because the bone-deep frequency in his ribs had shifted, and the new pattern it carried was not recognition but invitation. Clear, patient, ancient beyond measure, and unmistakably addressed to him. His fingers touched the surface. The material was warm. Not hot warm the way skin is warm, the way something alive maintains its temperature against the cold, and the moment his palm settled against the raised glyphs, the sphere's light expanded. It did not flash. It bloomed. Gold radiance poured from the glyph channels like water finding a course after a long dry season, filling the hold with warm light that erased his headlamp's beam, erased the shadows, erased the 500,000 years of darkness that had held this space since the builders sealed it. The ribbed structural members overhead caught the light and refracted it into arcing fans of amber, and for a moment the interior of the hold looked like what it must have looked like when it was new. A cathedral of purpose, every surface designed to catch and carry light, every line converging on the platform where a human hand would one day rest. The sphere spoke. Not in sound, not in frequency. In the glyphs themselves, the raised symbols under his palm rearranged, cycling through configurations faster than his eye could track, and then stopped. A single line of text, pressed against his skin from the inside by a mechanism that had waited 500,000 years for a palm to read it. He read it with his hand and his bones, and the part of his brain that recognized pattern below the threshold of conscious thought, where language existed before it became speech. The line said, "Welcome home, warden of the long sail." The sphere pulsed once gold, and the glyph channels in the deck flared in sequence, not randomly, not in the branching pattern that had tracked his footsteps, but in a coordinated cascade that ran from the platform through the hold to the breach and beyond, up through the hull, across the exterior surface that the dig team had spent 18 months exposing to canyon daylight. 12,000 glyphs, igniting in order, each one a word in a sentence that the ship had been composing in silence since before any living civilization had recorded its first year. The vibration traveled through the platform, through his boots, up through his legs and spine and into his skull, where the bone frequency met his own neural architecture and resolved like a chord finding its tonic. The ship was not waking up. It had never been asleep. It had been waiting, sealed, patient, its system suspended at a depth that instruments read as death, because the compact had no category for a machine that was alive and still, the way a held breath is alive and still, the way a seed in dry ground is alive and still until the water finally comes. The vibration settled into a steady hum. The glyph light stabilized to warm amber that turned the black alloy surfaces to burnished bronze. The sphere in his hands, and he was holding it now, cradling it against his chest without remembering the act of lifting it, had gone quiet. Its light was steady, its surface warm, the raised glyphs fixed in a configuration he could feel against his palms. He could not read them consciously. But some part of him recognized the pattern the way you recognize a room you lived in as a child, not through memory, but through the body's certainty that this space was once yours. The ship shuddered, a settling like a long-held breath released, and from deep in the hull, from sections buried under 90 meters of sediment that no excavation had reached, sounds began. Not the groan of stressed metal, but the clean, sequential activation of systems designed to operate after geological timescales of rest. Seals releasing with soft pneumatic sighs, conduits pressurizing in measured stages, structural members shifting from compressed holding positions into operational alignment with precise clicks that rang through the hull like a clock, beginning to keep time after 500,000 years of silence. He looked back toward the breach. The gold glyph light had reached it and continued up through the hull plating, and through the opening he could see pale canyon daylight cross-hatched by amber luminescence, every carved groove on the exposed hull carrying steady light where before there had been only dead metal. His wrist unit chirped. A signal breaking through the canyon's electromagnetic interference for the first time since he had entered the ship. He answered. "Yale to base camp. I am inside the vessel. I have extensive active systems across the hold. The hull glyphs are illuminated on the entire exposed surface. The ship is undergoing a controlled startup sequence. I need the full team at the breach." A pause. Then Dr. Tenek's voice, carrying a register he had never heard from her, not alarm, but the particular focus of a woman whose 30 years of frontier experience had just encountered something outside their scope. "Corin, we can see the hull from the rim. The entire exposed surface is lit. We are getting light through the sediment layer in at least 3 locations." "What did you do?" "I made contact with an artifact in the central hold, a sphere on a raised platform. The contact initiated a system-wide activation." "You touched it, without authorization, without hazard assessment, without—" "Dr. Tenek, the glyphs on the hull." "What about them?" "They are human." Silence, not a dropped signal. The silence of a trained mind encountering a proposition that required a moment before language could carry it. "They are a pre-compact human writing system," he continued. "The same system I documented on the Dren's Reach monolith. I confirmed the morphological match 9 months ago. The chisel depth ratios, the stroke sequencing, the tool marks, all consistent with human hand biomechanics. The ship was built by our species, Dr. Tenek. Built and sealed and buried here deliberately, and it was programmed to wait." "Wait for what?" He looked at the sphere. Its gold light pulsed with a warmth that felt like patience, the warmth of a fire maintained by someone who knew the traveler was still far away, but would arrive before the tending was needed. "For one of us to come back." The team descended in stages. Tenek first, her harness line singing against the hull edge, her boots finding the deck with the precise placement of a woman who had rappelled into 600 excavation sites. Rast followed, his portable analysis kit strapped to his chest, his scanner already running before he touched down. Then Jovel, the structural engineer, methodical and silent behind her environment suit visor. Then Petter, the youngest, a graduate student whose field journal was open before his harness was unclipped. They stopped when they reached the hold. All of them. The glyph light was bright enough now to cast gold shadows, and the 4 figures standing at the edge of the illuminated floor looked, in that light, like witnesses to something they had not been trained to witness. Rast recovered first. He walked to the nearest glyph channel, knelt, and ran his scanner along its length. Read the output. Ran it again. Adjusted the calibration, ran a 3rd pass, and then looked up at Corin with the focused intensity of a scientist whose instruments were returning data that did not fit his model. "This emission is not luminescent in any conventional sense," he said. "Not photonic, not chemical, not plasma-based. The glyph channels are producing light through a mechanism I cannot classify." "I know. The alloy in the deck is producing a standing wave at a frequency my acoustic sensor reads as biological in origin. The waveform matches, Corin. The waveform matches a human bone conduction signature. It is calibrated to resonate with human skeletal density." "I know." Rast looked at the sphere cradled against Corin's chest. His scanner tracked toward it. Whatever the readings showed, they made him lower the instrument and simply look. A gesture Corin had never seen from a man who trusted his tools more than his eyes. "That object is reading your genome through dermal contact. The glyph pattern on its surface is reconfiguring in real time based on your genetic profile. It is identifying you." Tenek was beside them now, her face in the gold light showing the controlled expression of a dig lead, absorbing something that exceeded every contingency she had planned for. "Dr. Yale, you said the glyphs are human. Pre-compact human writing predates any known human spacefaring civilization by a minimum of 300,000 years. By approximately 500,000 years, based on the geology. You are telling me that humanity had a spacefaring civilization 500,000 years ago. I am telling you that this ship was built by human hands, sealed by human hands, and designed to wait for a human hand to reactivate it. The evidence is the hull glyphs, the monolith correlation, the toolmark analysis, the interior artifacts, the reception figure in the 3rd starboard compartment, and the sphere I am holding. which identified me as human the moment I touched it and has not stopped reading my genome since. Tenek looked at the sphere. At the hold, its ribbed ceiling lit to its full architectural grandeur, a vaulted space built with the proportions of a cathedral and the engineering tolerance of a precision instrument, every structural member positioned to carry light from the glyph channels and distribute it across the interior, creating an illumination that was not merely functional but intentional, designed to be beautiful when the moment came, designed to show the person standing on the platform what they had come home to. "What did it say to you?" she asked. Her dig-lead authority was still there, but underneath it was something older, the voice of a person standing at the edge of comprehension. It said, "Welcome home, Warden of the Long Sail." Warden. A keeper, a custodian, someone who carries something forward, not a commander, not a ruler. The ship hummed around them. From the lower hull, the activation sounds continued, seals and conduits and structural shifts, the sequential reawakening of systems that had been dormant since before the canyon existed. Rast's scanner tracked each new acoustic signature, and his expression tightened with each one, because each signature confirmed what the first had suggested. The systems were not failing or degrading. They were operating exactly as designed, 500,000 years after their last activation, with a precision that made the compact's best engineering look like rough carpentry. Jovel spoke for the first time. She had been standing with her hand against a structural rib since she entered the hold, feeling the vibrations, and her voice carried the flat certainty of an engineer delivering a professional assessment. The activation sequence is structural. This vessel is shifting from a dormant compression state to an operational load-bearing configuration. The ribbed members are repositioning. If this continues, the hull geometry will change. The sediment around the lower sections may not hold. "Meaning what?" Tenek asked. "Meaning if this ship decides to stand up, 90 meters of canyon geology will not stop it." Nobody spoke for a moment. The ship hummed. The glyphs pulsed. And in the gold-lit darkness of the hold, the oldest human engineering in existence continued its unhurried return to function, indifferent to the schedules, the protocols, and the safety perimeters of the civilization that had forgotten it existed. Tenek looked at Korin. She looked at the sphere in his hands, at the gold light on his face, at the glyph channels on the deck pulsing in rhythm with a frequency that his skeleton was apparently designed to receive. And she asked the question the ship had already answered, but that she needed to hear from a human voice. "What does it want?" "It wants me to carry it forward. All of it. The ship, the cargo, the language, the record of what we were before we forgot. It was not sealed to hide it. It was sealed to preserve it until someone came back who was willing to accept the responsibility." That is a significant claim from a single artifact contact. It is a significant ship. Tenek held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked at the sphere again and at the hold, and at the walls of a vessel that her species had built before her species remembered building anything, and Korin watched the dig-lead authority in her expression make room for something else. Not credulity, recognition. The same thing the sphere had given him, arrived at through different means, not through bone frequency, but through 30 years of professional instinct telling her that some things were exactly what they appeared to be. "Then we had better start carrying," she said quietly. He stood on the platform and held the sphere, and understood what was being asked. Not demanded, asked. The bone frequency was steady in his chest, clear and patient, and it was not a command. It was a question, the same question the reception figure on the wall had been posing with its open palms for 500,000 years. "Will you carry it forward?" The chambers he had passed, the storage room full of carved objects, the workstations waiting for operators, the small room with the boots and the garment and the human figure, were not a museum. They were an inheritance, packed and sealed by people who had known, with the certainty of engineers designing for the longest failure mode imaginable, that their civilization would not survive intact. not destroyed by war or cataclysm, dissolved, spread so thin across time, and forgetting that the descendants who eventually returned to the stars would not remember that they had been there before. The ship was the memory, the glyphs were the language, the sphere was the key. And the warden was the one who agreed to keep it all, not to wield it for power, not to trade it for prestige, not to hand it to a committee that would study it until the funding cycle ended and the next priority displaced it. To keep it the way a warden keeps anything, by being present, by paying attention, by doing the small, unglamorous work of preservation that nobody notices until it stops being done. Corin was 41 years old. His career was modest. His specialty was narrow. His funding was perpetually inadequate, and his publication record was the kind that tenure committees regarded with polite disinterest before moving on to candidates with broader impact metrics and better networking instincts. He had spent 23 years walking into places that other people had walked out of, measuring things that other people had decided were not worth measuring, and writing papers that other people cited when they needed a footnote and forgot when they needed a name. But the ship had not opened for a committee chair. It had not opened for a department head or a keynote speaker or any of the archaeologists whose careers his career existed quietly beneath. It had opened for a man who measured chisel depth, because chisel depth was the level at which the oldest human language could still be read, and reading it was the first act of carrying it forward. The most granular detail, the smallest unit of evidence. The thing that nobody with funding believed mattered, except that it was the only thing that had mattered in the end, because everything else had been looked at, and everything else had been wrong, and the truth had been sitting in the depth of a carved line, waiting for someone patient enough to measure it. Yes, he said, aloud, to a ship that spoke in bone frequency and glyph light, because some answers needed to be given in the voice you were born with, regardless of whether the listener used ears. The ship heard him. The hum changed, not in pitch or volume but in character, from the steady vibration of systems activating to something warmer, something that sounded like relief. Like a breath released after an interval so long that the concept of intervals had lost its meaning. The glyph channels brightened, the amber deepened to rich gold, and from the buried sections of the hull, from chambers and corridors and holds that 90 meters of stone had hidden from every instrument the team possessed, a new sound rose, not mechanical, harmonic. A chord structure building from the lowest registers, each tone joining the last, creating a resonance that filled the hold and made the dust mote spiral in geometric patterns. The same patterns the glyphs traced on the deck, rendered now in light and sound and particulate motion, the ship expressing in every medium it possessed the thing the sphere had already said. Welcome home. The road was long, and you are the last we will ask to walk it. Tenek's team stood at the edges of the hold. Petter was crying quietly, unaware of it, his field journal open, his stylus motionless, his face gold-lit and wet. Rast had set down his scanner for the first time since entering the hold and stood with his arms at his sides, looking up at the ceiling with the expression of a man whose model of the universe had just gained a dimension he had not budgeted for. Jovel had both palms pressed flat against the nearest structural rib, feeling the vibration travel through her hands and arms, and her face held the steady certainty of an engineer who recognized sound construction regardless of who had built it, or when, the professional respect of one builder for another, separated by 500,000 years, but joined by the universal language of a load properly born. Tenek crossed the hold. She walked through the glyph light to the platform where Corin stood, and she looked at the sphere and at him, and at the cathedral of amber light that human hands had built 500,000 years before her own species. The Tessarene had catalogued their first alien ruin. Her expression was not the dig lead's controlled assessment anymore. It was something simpler, quieter. The face of someone standing in a place that was older than comprehension and finding, against all expectation, that the place had been built for exactly this moment. "What do we do now?" she asked. He thought about the chambers waiting to be opened, the workstations waiting for hands, the language waiting to be read, 12,000 hull glyphs that were now burning in steady gold visible from the canyon rim, from orbit, from anywhere in the sector that someone pointed a telescope at the right coordinates. He thought about the decades of work that lay ahead, the translations, the catalogs, the debates and the disputes and the arguments that would ripple through every academic institution in the compact as the implications settled in. The slow, patient, unglamorous work of reconstructing a history that his species had forgotten so completely that the forgetting itself had become invisible. He thought about the sphere in his hands, warm, steady, patient, still reading his genome, still adjusting its glyph patterns to his presence, still answering a question that had been asked 500,000 years ago by people who had trusted that the answer, when it came, would be enough. "We begin," he said, "one glyph at a time." He set the sphere carefully on the platform. In the moment of separation he felt something, not loss, not pain, but a thinning, as though a signal that had been running through him at full strength dimmed to half its amplitude when his skin left the surface. The sphere's glyph pattern, which had been locked into the configuration his genome had triggered, began to shift again, slowly, tentatively, like a hand reaching across a table to check whether the other person was still there. He pressed his fingertips against its surface, the pattern stilled, the signal returned. The sphere's gold light pulsed once, a beat that felt like gratitude or relief, or perhaps just the mechanical confirmation of a system designed to maintain contact functioning as intended. He could not tell the difference yet. That understanding, he suspected, would take years. Above him, through the breach, the canyon daylight had shifted from its early morning gray to the pale gold of midday, and the light it threw into the hold mixed with the amber of the glyph channels to create something warmer than either, a color that had no name, a light that belonged neither to the star overhead nor to the ship beneath, but to the meeting of both. Rast was already running scans of the glyph channels near the breach, his data pad filling with readings he kept shaking his head at, not in disbelief, but in the particular frustration of a scientist whose instruments were delivering data too clean to dismiss and too strange to categorize. Jovel had begun mapping the structural shifts in the ribbed members overhead. Petter had found the first secondary chamber and was documenting it from the doorway with the careful, precise strokes of a young man who understood, perhaps for the first time in his academic career, that the work he had trained for actually mattered. Good, they were doing the work. The committees would come. The departments would argue. The compact's political machinery would grind into motion, and every faction with a stake in humanity's past or future would claim a piece of what this ship represented. All of that would happen, and when it did, the record that Corin and his team built in these first hours, careful, complete, measured to the chiseled depth, would be the only thing standing between the truth of this ship and the stories that powerful people would want to tell about it. He opened his field journal. The blank page waited, the same patience the ship had shown, the same quiet confidence that, given time, the page would fill. He wrote Day 1 Interior, Hold Central, Platform with Sphere Artifact active upon human contact, Glyph channels responsive to human presence. 12,000 hull glyphs confirmed human in origin. Beginning systematic documentation. The sphere pulsed gold. The ship sang its deep chord. And the warden of the long sail began the longest catalog of his life, one glyph at a time, carrying forward what had been left behind.